Okay, thank you. That was great. I look forward to the questions at the end. We will now present on our SHOC project, a 5-year research project that's been investigating the use of digital assessment that leads to portfolios in schools in Victoria, and how this has sort of started to impact on our thinking in our teacher education program around using a similar type of tool. On here is our website. We have lots of publications to that link, and also innovations by teachers using digital assessment leading portfolios in all different types of schools. So if you want to follow up, that will be available to them. I'll now pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Sanford.
Thank you. So we just want to take a moment to do a territorial acknowledgement. So all of us are working and living in the Victoria area. And we want to acknowledge with great respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories the university stands, in which we all live and work, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Saanich peoples, whose historical relationships continue to this day. And we think that's really critically important, particularly in light of what has been transpiring in the last while. But in a general sense, we really value the place in which we're able to work and develop relationships with our Indigenous colleagues and community.
Thank you. Dr. Hong.
Yeah, here is the brief context of this research. It's a use of, we are researching into the use of digital portfolios in elementary, middle, and secondary schools, and also joining on our insights in the university. And there are very diverse digital platforms that that have been used in this respect. And we're exploring ways in which school practices can inform higher education. Next, here is our overarching research question. We ask, how can the digital reform the ways we communicate and report student learning in BC schools? Particularly, we are focusing on the third sub-question, that is, what actually shifts the ways that, okay. Yeah, you can see it there in educational assumptions and practices that are actually helps the implementation of digital portfolios and other alternative assessment. Our supporting literature actually comes from research in the 21st century assessment, where traditional systems of letter grade have been critiqued, where high-stake tests for summative grading leads to issues in student learning, and also where the traditional report card with a single or a combination of grades is not well suited to meet the challenges of the 21st century learning. We use multiple case studies in elementary, middle, and secondary schools, and to converge a diverse set of data where we have the interviews, observations, portfolio examples, as well as 2 workshops that we held with the teachers and administrators in the schools. In the research, we are drawn to teachers' motivation of why they are shifting their assessment practices. They recognize that the traditional assessment practices do not support student learning and not align with BC redesigned curriculum. They visualize assessment that demonstrate student ownership, focus on the process, articulate the student learning, self-assessment, and assessing competencies rather than content memory.
So when you look at the process of portfolios in the schools and from the literature, they identify there's 3 emerging types that are commonly seen. So there's a learning portfolio, collecting together your understandings of your learning from some type of repository, organizing it in order to share it. That can be showcased to a particular audience, a target audience you're going for, or it could be used for assessment in relation to accreditation. So typically this is how it's been described. And we actually saw that in the schools, and we'll unpack that a second. But we also started to imagine could there be more than these three types that are emerging? So first of all, what it looks like in the school. Artifacts tended to be things that could represent a story, tells what the student has learned. And it could come in multiple forms, and it could always associate a past experience. And it was really a way of remembering and interconnecting. And it was very much inspiring by the new technologies to do things you couldn't imagine 10, 20 years ago. In relation to inside the schools, from the 9 teachers over 2 years and the observations, we started to sort of realize what was emerging around these 3 sort of clusters. And we looked at it in relation to the type of audience that was being imagined, the purpose, the process, and the format. So we took these 3 from literature, and then we started to overlay what we were seeing in the schools. So from a learning point of view, the audience is teacher and student. But the purpose is very much engaged with this sort of meta idea, the notion of understanding your own learning. What caused you to do what you did? What did you learn from that process? And less about how good was it at the end. That also meant that the students were really starting to think about the curriculum as a vehicle towards their growth, rather than I've got to do something that's perfect. And then the format was tend to be descriptive, narrative, and it reminded me of the self-study of the previous presentation, where they're really starting to unpack who am I becoming through this learning process. In relation to the assessment, similar, but now the imagined audience is this ministry, right? So we're doing something for this other outside. And so the progress is in relation to the competencies in the curriculum. So though there's a learning one, now it's sort of being filtered towards something that is seen as someone else is looking at. And it has to be evidence that meets requirements of that type of curriculum that we're working on. So at what level did you apply the skills you're learning? You know, what are your strengths in relation to that? And what learning goals do you have based on this? So it was way more structured, and the format was still similar to the previous one, but now the language is becoming more formal, less to myself and more to somebody else unknown. The showcase one, now this again was different because there's an audience in mind. It's my mum, it's my auntie, it's somebody who I think will be interested in what I've done. So that audience means I want to show my best work. I want to impress my imaginary audience, but it also led to some comparison with other students, you know, who's got the best. But it was there with that audience in mind. And a good teacher was seeing that and overlapped that with the accreditation one. So you sort of had a mixing, but now really it's a more of a personal thing. It's a language that I want to articulate. And I want to tell that person who I value why I value this thing. So it's a shift. So we have these 3 types of portfolios going on. However, the most important one is this learning one. But when this learning one is being driven by an external, you know, you're putting it from these cloud-based systems, the repository, there's always this showcase accreditation, which wasn't quite, we think there's something missing. But that's what we would describe as what was going on in the schools. Over to Kathy.
So I'm just going to briefly talk about 4 case studies that we have developed through time working with these teachers. And the first one we saw was the teacher was very much focused on the students' learning. So this was an elementary classroom. They were using a platform called Fresh Grade. Some of you might have heard of it. And so the teacher was focusing on metacognition. She was really wanting them to be aware of their learning, of why they liked the piece of work and why they chose that piece of work to put in their portfolios. So the showcase and the accreditation were much smaller aspects of how they were thinking in this particular classroom. In the second case, there was a different emphasis. So this is again is a kindergarten classroom. But the teacher's mindset was quite different. So she was looking at this more as a way of sharing with parents. So she already had an audience in mind that was not the students, and the focus was not so much on their learning, although there was definitely some of that, but it was on this other audience, which was the parents. And the accreditation for moving into grade 1 was a very small component in this particular case. In the third case, there was sort of a balance of all 3 things. The learning was still going on. This was a high school classroom using a different platform. This is called My Blueprint. And so the focus with My Blueprint is much more career focused. So moving out of high school into post-secondary or into a workplace. And so there was a balance of all three of the different types of thinking, certainly learning, but a lot more of a showcase, like what do I take out into the world, and then accreditation for completing high school. In the last case, again, there was a balance of the three of them, but this is a middle school classroom. So depending on the grade and the age of the students, there was also a shift in the teachers' thinking as well. So again, this was a fresh grade platform, and they were focusing on learning, but also accreditation, moving into a high school environment, aware of parents and the need to share evidence of learning with parents, because this was used instead of report cards. But there was also that notion of accreditation moving into particular courses in high school.
Tiago.
So the work with portfolio has showed us a shift from individualistic to collaborative thinking, both from the teachers' perspectives and also from students' perspectives. So portfolios enable moving from individual learning to a learning that is more collaborative and understandings are shared. It also brings out the good of the group, but also keeps the individual inside that group as they collaborate to that project or the work. The learning is rather shared rather than competitive. And learning is more iterative and ongoing rather than an event. In the case of an exam, for example, that would finish a unit. And the diversity here is seen as an asset when it is shared with the community by the different types of a portfolio. And it focuses more on holistic understandings rather than on fragmented pieces. So we do have these types of portfolios that we have examined, showcase and learning, and how they relate to one another. So for example, learning, they might, and as it moves to showcase, it's a way for you to demonstrate the best work you have put together. Whereas when we have accreditation, the relationship between the types of portfolios is a bit different, and we have lines here that will show us that. So we do have a line that moves horizontally regarding ownership, how much is mine and how much is collaborative, and how I move upwards in regarding my competencies when I want to show accreditation. But also there seems to be something missing here. So we talked about these three types of portfolios, but this collaborative part seems to be missing in the descriptions that we had from the types of portfolios here. And that's when we come to a different type of portfolio that we've been, that emerged from our work here, which is a network portfolio. So the audience here is personal, it's parents, it's friends, it's school peers, and community colleagues who might be interested in the artifacts that are being produced. And the purpose is to share those artifacts, possibly made with peers. So not just something you worked yourself to show your work, but something that you have collaborated with. And the format is like a format that the audience would appreciate, and it shows ownership, personal ownership, but also a collaborative ownership. So we do have now new lines that we have added here, and new relationships between these types of portfolios, for example, moving from personal to shared ownership. And this competency now also moves, and we got just a new transition for this slide. Yes, so it becomes a more evidential competency, and the best work is actually an articulated best work. And then the lines between this portfolio seem to be disappearing a bit. They are fading in a sense that maybe it's one portfolio, but it can act as for different purposes. And on the next slide, we're going to see this. So before we had these things that were very compartmentalized, but now we see that the networking portfolio, or the idea of networking portfolio, can put all of these pieces together, and you could use them for accreditation. You could use them for showcase as a showcase portfolio.
Kathy.
So just in thinking about all of those things, you know, being much more intentional about our uses with portfolios. So this particular one, we didn't have a lot of time with our students, and we wanted to have them thinking about their learning. So we just used Google Slides. So recognizing that the platform isn't necessarily the most important thing, but the intentions of what we're doing with the portfolios and how it fits into their notion of assessment is really critically important. So this is just an example of how we use a very linear platform to enable them to think in a more iterative kind of way.
And then in the other course, this COVID year, everything was online, but I actually could work out in the school. So I got the students actually planning together in a collective in Google. So they basically did a collective repository learning portfolio and then used a system, a Mahara system online as a learning hub, and put those two things together. So now it was collective, creating evidence. They started developing their portfolios, drawing from their experience in the school, and that became sort of their portfolio, but it came from a collective beginning. So we end up with sort of this network beginning that then leads to this learning hub, which then leads down to the learning portfolio that then becomes accreditation. And at the end, we ended up with a showcase interview going back, and teachers were interviewing the students as they completed. So this sort of became this cyclic process of doing a portfolio, all based on that networking idea. And finalize, Kath.
So just in conclusion, we're recognizing that we really need to not only think about, but talk about the connections between assessment and learning that our portfolio use is enabling them. To see assessment is happening all the time, and the ownership of the work that's being done really needs to shift. And we're thinking about you know, how we reimagine assessment so that it isn't this top-down colonial patriarchal model, but it really is shifting to something that allows us to walk the talk and not just speak about we should be shifting, but really shifting mindsets, recognizing capabilities of our learners that are really diverse, and going back to what was said before, recognizing diversity as an asset, recognizing that we need everybody's diverse perspectives coming into the conversation to actually move us all forward in a collaborative, collective, where we value and honor community as much as we value individual progress. And so I think that's where we're leaving it right now, is that this is a really big shift that's going to take a lot more talking and working, but really important to move this forward, I think. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.